Welcome to Camera Basics. In here, we're going to cover some really simple stuff, but also a few really important things. I'm going to talk for just a moment about the type of camera, the sensor, a few of your primary controls, and then we're going to talk about the important stuff, the file settings. So let's get into it. First up, this is a mirrorless camera, which means we don't have a mirror like the DSLRs. Have interchangeable lenses. We have an aperture in the lenses that can control the amount of light coming in to the camera. From there, light is going to go pretty much straight into the image sensor here, and so that's where it captures the image. And so it's going to collect information, and it's got this dual processor thing that allows it to record images and send it out at the same time. So whether it's on the monitor or on the viewfinder, you'll be able to see when you are shooting stuff, what you are exactly shooting. So we're going to talk a lot about the monitor and the EVF later on in this class as well. And so that's just kind of your basics on a mirrorless camera. Now, of course, one of the most important components in any camera is the image sensor. This is going to have a lot to do with the image quality and what types of images it's good at shooting. So this uses what I would consider to be a larger size sensor compared to a lot of competing cameras out there. It's not the largest, but it's one of the larger sizes. And this is based off of 35mm film. Now, there's nothing perfect about 35mm film. It was kind of a happy medium between larger cameras and smaller cameras. And so it was just kind of a nice Goldilocks size. And so when we switched over to digital, well, that's what kind of a lot of photographers wanted. And that's where this fits in. There are some very good cameras that have smaller size sensors, but that's not really a topic for this particular class. And so this is why it'll be known as a full frame camera, because it's the same size as a 35mm piece of film. So other sizes include APS-C and the 4/3 system. As I say, there's a lot of good variety of options of products in there, just not something we're going to talk about here and now. Now, the basic controls on this camera, we have an on-off on the top of the camera. When you do turn it on or turn it off, there is an image sensor that can knock dust off the sensor. And this can be very helpful because dust on the sensor is going to show itself as black dots in plain areas like the sky or a white wall, and this can be really irritating. So this is something that a lot of cameras do, and generally it does a pretty good job. Now, if something does get stuck on there, which can happen, there are manual ways of cleaning it off, and I'll talk about that later on into the class. Shutter release for taking photos, pretty obvious there. The main command dial is the thumb dial. So as you hold the camera with your right hand, it is that thumb dial in the back of the camera. That's the main control. So anytime you want to make an adjustment on a particular feature or setting, well, that's probably the first place you're going to go to make that change. On the front of the camera is the sub command dial. And when we get to setting our exposure manually, you'll see that one dial does one thing and the other dial does something else. And so this will also be true in other features as we go throughout the camera. Now, over on the back of the camera, there is a photo and video switch, and this changes a whole lot about how the camera works. And so you want to be really clear as to whether you're taking still photos or video, because the camera is set up very, very differently for operation between those two. And that is probably one of the easiest mistakes I or possibly you will make when shooting with the camera is this doesn't look right. It's not acting normal. Oh, I got it in the wrong mode. And it's pretty simple. Just keep that switch in the right area for whatever you're doing. For most of this class, we're going to have it in the photo mode. There is section 9, which talks about video shooting, and then we're going to go into the full thing on video. The multi-selector in the back of the camera, I may forget this name throughout this class because every company has their own name for this. The 4-way thumb down, up, left, right switch in the back. Well, the multi-selector is how we're going to navigate the menu system. We can move the focusing points around and select and choose different items in the various different menus that we get into. In the middle is the OK button. This is kind of like the return button on your computer. It confirms a setting that you have highlighted with the multi-selector. And so we'll be using the OK button quite frequently to confirm our selection. Now, the sub-selector or the joystick is a great control for moving the focusing point around, but we can also navigate through the menu system as well as a variety of the other menus and operations of the camera. Now, this is also a button where you can push straight in on it to perform another function. And so this is something that we'll talk more about as we get to the different functions in the camera. Now, this also has a touch screen on it, So if you want to operate the camera from the screen, you want to zoom into images, you want to swipe through the images that you've shot, or you want to navigate the menu system, yes, you can do it on the back of the camera. If you don't like using touch screens, well, that's perfectly fine. You can turn off the touchscreen options and work everything on the camera with its standard buttons and dials. And so whatever choice you want is what you can do here. Now, some of the Nikon buttons, well, they're a little bit different in that you need to press down and hold down on the button. There's a little bit of a safety protocol with this. And then you would turn the dial, make your setting, and then release your finger off the button. And this is a good safety operation for certain types of settings that pressing the button actually doesn't do anything. It just makes it available for changing. You have to press the button and turn the dial at the same time. Now, if you want to dive into the custom settings, you can turn this particular feature off. And what will happen then is when you press the button, that feature will become active for about 6 seconds. You can make your change, and then after about 6 seconds, it'll just lock itself in. And so there are different operations, but this is the standard operation for these, as well as a few other operations you'll see as we move around the camera. Now, the shutter release is something that you're going to become very familiar with. It is a two-step process. When you press halfway down, it starts metering. It will autofocus if the camera is set to autofocus. It will wake the camera up if the camera is currently asleep. Cameras tend to go to sleep kind of pretty quickly because they're using battery power and they want to conserve batteries. And so that is also something you control, is how quickly it goes to sleep. But press halfway down, it will wake the camera up. And if for some reason you are lost in the menu system, which can happen to people, press halfway down on the shutter release and it instantly kicks you out of the menu system and gets you ready for shooting photos. And so just be familiar with that half touch on the shutter release. It's something that most photographers get a good feel for because they need it on a regular basis. Now, one of the things about this pressing down halfway is it does activate the autofocus system. And not everybody likes this. It's a little bit more advanced way of operating a camera in what is known as back button autofocus. And we'll talk about this more later on in the focus section of the class. But if you want to deactivate the focusing that is attributed to the shutter release button, well, you can go into custom settings menu under A focus, under A6 AF activation, and you can flip that switch off so that when you press down on the shutter release, the camera will not focus. There's a button on the back of the camera called AF on that you can focus instead there. And that's the way some people like to work. And as I say, I'll talk more about that in the focus section. Next up, definitely one of the most important settings in your camera is the image quality. This is the whole RAW versus JPEG option. So if you want the highest quality images, the most resolution, the most versatility in post-production, you're going to want to shoot RAW. It's a 14-bit file and allows you great latitude, especially controlling the highlights and shadows. And that's why it's going to be very valuable for a lot of photographers. Now, of course, we can shoot JPEG straight in camera here. This is a smaller 8-bit file. Much smaller in file size. It's going to be easier to transfer and send. It's something that we also use for a wide variety of programs. And so JPEGs are very useful. If you have a RAW, well, you can create a JPEG anytime you have a computer and software to work with them. Once you have a JPEG, you can't go to a RAW from that. And so I recommend most people shoot in RAW for most things. That's going to give you the most control later on, but there are people who do need JPEG images, which is why it's in here as an option. Now, we do have the new kid on the block here, which is the HEIF image, which is a new and improved JPEG in some manner of speaking. This is going to be a little bit larger 10-bit file, so it's going to give you a bit more color information, give you a bit more latitude to work with when it comes to those shadows and highlights and getting the contrast of your image to look right in there. Now, there is going to be a separate setting, I'll talk about that in just a moment, between switching between JPEG and HEIF images. And once you get that set up, when you come here to image quality, you'll see that you have raw JPEG options or raw HEIF options. And so they're kind of set in different places. A little strange, but that's the way it's set up. Now, the basic option for most people is going to be raw and JPEG in here. Shooting raw gets you 45 megapixels, and it's going to get you a large file that gives you a lot of versatility down the road. Now, the file size will vary a little bit, as you can see here, from about 20 to 53 megabytes in size. And that's because there are 3 different versions of the RAW that you can shoot. They're all really good, but there's just some subtle differences. We'll talk more about those in section 12. I'll show you some examples and give you some recommendations on the settings for that. But just in general, the raw image is a great way to go for most people. Now, the JPEG images will come in different compression settings. We have fine, normal, and basic. We actually have not 3, but 6 settings because these are broken into 2. The ones with the little asterisk beside it are ones of slightly higher quality. Now, all of these are 45 megapixels in size, so they give you lots of resolution, but it's taking that resolution and compressing it more in some of those and less in others. And so if you are going to shoot JPEGs, you can really get the JPEG fit according to the needs that you might have. Now, if you are not sure what you're going to be doing, but you do want to shoot JPEG, well, I definitely recommend shooting the fine quality so that you get the highest quality image possible. In general, I recommend RAW in most cases. But if you do need JPEG, you can choose a very specific size one that fits your needs. Now, you can, of course, shoot RAW and JPEG at the same time. So you get 2 photos every time you press the shutter release 1 time down. Now, the advantage here is that you have a raw image that you can always go back to and make infinite adjustments to, but you also get an immediate JPEG that you can use right away without having to download the RAWs and create JPEGs and export them and so forth. And so this can be very handy for people with kind of special workflows, you might say. The average photographer probably doesn't need RAW plus JPEG. Myself, I shoot RAW, and then if I need a JPEG, I'll make a JPEG, but I'm usually not in a hurry for those images. People with fast turnaround workflows might need that RAW plus JPEG. But in this case, we're talking about still 45 megapixel images. We can reduce the number of megapixels, and we'll get to that here in just a moment. All right, so choosing between JPEG and HEIF, well, there are some differences here. We're going to do this adjustment and change in the tone modes, which is in the photo shooting menu, where you can choose SDR or HLG, standing for Standard Dynamic Range and Hybrid Log Gamma. This is going to be the difference between the 8-bit file and the 10-bit file. Now, on a technical level, the difference between this is the number and range of colors that you can capture. 8-bit images are pretty good images. This is what most people are looking at most of the time on their computer screens or on their phones. This is giving you 16 million colors, and it's going to be perfectly good for standard everyday photography and image showing. The HEIF images, the HLG setting, is going to be a 10-bit image, which gives you 1 billion colors and just gives you more latitude. This is going to help out when it comes to HDR screens, or if you want to edit and really work with your images in a post-production program like, say, Photoshop, so that you are working with the shadows and the highlights. It's going to give you more control in that regard. So it is definitely technically superior to JPEG. The problem is that JPEG is much more common right now. And so you're going to have to check to see what programs you use and are they compatible with HEIF images. And so if you do use a number of different software programs, I recommend that you shoot the HEIF image along with the JPEG and do some comparison testing on your own to see if everything works equally quick and as well as you would expect and hope for. Because the limited compatibility is really the catch right now at the time I'm recording this class, but maybe in the future it becomes much more popular, or maybe it completely fades out. I don't know what the future holds. The minimum ISO is 400, so there is a little bit of a limitation there. And there'll be a number of features that are grayed out in the menu system of the camera when you select this. And so just realize that certain things are not available when this is turned on. And when this is turned off, set to JPEG for most people, there are other things that are turned off and that are not available. And so be aware of that when you are setting things in the camera. Let's go ahead and dive in and show you both of these last 2 options that we've been talking about here in the camera. All right, so we're going to dive into the menu system, and we're going to go over to the left and go up to the photo shooting menu. And up near the top are some of the most important things in here. And the one that we've been talking about here is the tone mode there and image quality. So you'll notice my camera is the way it is after doing a camera reset. And as I come over here, you'll see that it is set to a standard JPEG, a normal JPEG, which is a bit low quality. And so that would be a mistake to just shoot everything on that, in my opinion. If you want the highest quality, I would probably shoot the RAW right there. This is going to give you the most versatility later on. Now, if you don't have the software to read a RAW, because you are going to need either Nikon or other software that reads the RAW, you might want to shoot RAW plus one of the JPEG options here. And I'm actually going to select that now so that I can select RAW and JPEG options later on. I think most people are probably best, as I say, just at RAW, but this is where you make that selection in there. And if you have chosen the HEIF option, you will get HEIF images. If you've chosen the JPEG option, you'll get JPEG. You can see that both are listed in there right now. Now, the whole JPEG and HEIF option is set here in tone mode. If you go over to SDR, you can change it down to HLG, and this is going to get you HEIF images. Now, it doesn't really show it to you in here, and so you need to know right in here that SDR is going to be JPEG and HLG is the HEIF image. Most people in most situations, I'm going to recommend SDR for standard dynamic range. And that way you'll be getting standard JPEGs that work in most everyday software at this point in time. And so the camera is kind of future-proof, you might say. It's got this advanced system that we might be using in a number of years, more commonly in a lot of different programs. Next up is the image size settings, and this has to do with the number of pixels, all right, the resolution of the image. So you can go into image size and you can change it between large, medium, and small. And this can be handy when you know that you don't need something larger. 45 megapixels is a huge number of megapixels. This is designed for making very large enlargements. If you know that you don't need that, you can save a lot of file space by setting this to one of the smaller file sizes if you have a known project that you're working on where you know what the outcome is going to be. And so let's go ahead and dive in and take a look at some of these image size settings. And so it's just the kind of the next step down. And so you can come in here and you can go into the image size and you can very easily see what size of file that you are shooting there. And so recommend most people set it to large because that's why you got a really nice camera, so that you can shoot really nice high-end photos. Now, we will talk about the other settings in here when we dive into the menu section 12 on the photo shooting menu. We'll go through the details of some of those other settings because you can choose different areas, the DX and the FX area, and smaller file sizes if need be there. So I think at this point you should have your camera set up for the file types that you want. Those are, as I say, very important settings to have right before you go out and start doing a lot of shooting with this. So there you go, folks. Those are your camera basics. And after this, we're starting to get into the serious stuff.